Jeffrey Dahmer was a convicted serial killer who claimed the lives of 17 males between 1978 and 1991. His victims were gay males that he picked up at gay bars, strip malls, and bus stops. Many of his victims were African or Asian descent and lived high-risk lifestyles and often had serious criminal records. He would lure them back to his apartment with promises of money or sexual favors. His MO was to lace his victims' drink with drugs and then strangle them to death. After killing his victims, he would perform explicit acts on the body before dismembering and disposing of the body. He also engaged in cannibalism with several of his victims. In 1994, Dahmer was killed in prison by a fellow prisoner named Christopher Scarver. Everything started in June of 1978 when Dahmer picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks and offered to take him back to his father's house to drink beer. Hicks decided to leave, and Dahmer hit him in the back of the head with a 10-pound dumbbell. Dahmer then dissected, dissolved, and scattered Hicks' remains throughout his backyard. He later said he killed Hicks because, quote, he wanted Hicks to stay. He did not kill again for 9 years. By 1985, he was frequenting gay bathhouses where he would drug men and rape them as they lay unconscious. Although he was arrested twice for incidents of indecent exposure in 1982 and 1986, he only faced probation and was not charged for the rape.
So, Del, before we get more into Dahmer's crimes, can you explain a little bit more of what this high-risk lifestyle that many of his victims led was?
So, many of his victims were gay men who were also sex workers, prostitutes, and they also frequented spots where gay men hung out. Unfortunately, in 1978, people were not as accepting of homosexuality as we are today. And thus, people that wanted to victimize others would often go to these spots in order to have victims that wouldn't be able to go to the police based off their homosexual status at the time. The police, as we're going to get into later, were not fond of homosexuals and didn't take crime against homosexuals as seriously as they did heterosexual individuals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely a running theme of this Jeffrey Dahmer case. Dahmer's next victim after Stephen Hicks was Stephen Twomey. Dahmer picked him up from a bar and took him back to a hotel room. He later stated that he had no memory of actually murdering Twomey. After Twomey's death, he actively began to seek out victims. He became obsessed with the idea that he could turn his victims into zombies. He used different methods such as drilling holes into their skull and injecting hydrochloric acid or boiling water into their brains. He also had a desire for his victims to act as youthful and submissive sexual partners. A few months ago, in the beginning of the summer, ID did a special on Jeffrey Dahmer, and they spoke to a psychologist that I believe worked with him, and he had allegedly, Dahmer told this psychologist that once he was at a museum and I guess human bodies were on display, or there were photographs of like the inner workings of human bodies. And that's kind of when his sexual arousal with human bodies began. That's when he discovered it. He claimed he wanted to keep his victims with him and would regularly save body parts. When Dahmer's killing spree began, he lived with his grandmother, and he later moved into an apartment in a predominantly black neighborhood in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Conorak Synthesymphone was Dahmer's 13th victim. He was an immigrant who settled in Milwaukee at the age of 3. At the age of 14, he was approached by Dahmer, who offered him money in exchange for explicit pictures. Unbeknownst to him, Dahmer had been convicted of drugging and molesting his older brother, Keeson. Synthesymphone agreed to go back to Dahmer's apartment and pose for nude photos. Once there, Dahmer drugged the boy with halcyon, which is a powerful sedative. Dahmer started torturing the boy by drilling a hole into his head and filling it with hydrochloric acid. On the morning of May 27, 1991, Dahmer left the boy unconscious in his apartment while he went to the store. Synthesymphone awoke and ran out of Dahmer's apartment and caught the eye of Sandra Smith and Nicole Childress. He was naked, bleeding, and completely incoherent due to the drugs. While they called police, Dahmer showed up and claimed the boy was a drunken adult house guest of his. The police officers, John Balserac and Joseph Gabrish, arrived on the scene and talked to Dahmer and the boy separately. Due to the drugs in his system, the boy was considered unresponsive. Dahmer stated that the boy was his 19-year-old lover who drank too much on the weekends. The officers were convinced that it was a lover's quarrel and left the boy with Dahmer. Smith and Childress were very shaken up and actually had their aunt call the police again to check in on what had happened to the boy.
The officers showed clear and evident bias when investigating Dahmer's involvement with the boy. They didn't run a check on Dahmer, which would have flagged his previous conviction. Remember, Dahmer was arrested for drugging and sexually fondling a 13-year-old boy, which turned out to be the boy's older brother in 1988. He was sentenced to 5 years probation and 1 year in a work release camp. He was paroled 2 months early. They also didn't investigate the strange smell coming from Dahmer's apartment. If they did, they would have discovered the decaying body of. Also, they didn't listen to Smith and Childress, who was familiar with the boy, about their red flags, including Dahmer's demeanor and Dahmer not being able to remember the boy's name. Logic stands to reason that if Dahmer was involved with the boy like he said, he would know the boy's name. The officers made homophobic jokes and were laughing about the incident. Later evidence emerged that the officers made remarks such as the intoxicated Asian naked male was returned to his sober boyfriend, with laughter in the background as they made these statements. They described the incident as a squabble between homosexuals. When ordered to investigate another scene, one of the officers joked about washing off after visiting a homosexual, stating that, quote, my partner is going to get deloused at the station. They failed to follow up on a tip from a woman who had seen a missing poster of the boy. When Smith protested the police leaving, they threatened her with arrest. Bolserac and Gabrish sent the ambulance away despite not checking the boy thoroughly for any injuries. Keep in mind, as Jenny stated, the boy was clearly injured, yet the ambulance was never able to check on the boy. This entire police interaction had racist undertones due to Smith and Childress being of African descent and the boy being of Asian. This all had very negative effects. About 30 minutes after the police left, Dahmer killed the boy. Dahmer injected a lethal dose of hydrochloric acid into the boy's skull. He was afraid that the women were going to keep pressing the issue and that the police were going to return. Dahmer killed 4 more people before being arrested on July 22nd, 1991, when Tracy Edwards, Dahmer's next victim, broke free and called for help. The officers were initially fired, but were reinstated when they appealed. Later in his career, Bolseric was elected to be the head of the Milwaukee Police Union, and he retired with honors in 2017. The city agreed to pay $850,000 to the boy's family.
Aileen Lee Wournos was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. Wournos had a difficult childhood, to say the least. Her mother, Diane Wournos, was a teenager when she gave birth to Aileen and later abandoned her and her older brother Keith, leaving them to be raised with their grandparents. Aileen's grandmother was an alleged alcoholic, and her grandfather was extremely violent with her and her brother, often beating her with a belt. Wournos' father, Dale Pittman, was incarcerated for child molestation when Aileen was born. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia later in his life and ultimately died by suicide in his jail cell when Aileen was a child. Wournos' trauma continued into her teen years. She claimed to have been sexually abused by her grandfather. Then at age 14, she alleged she was raped by a friend of her grandfather's and became pregnant. She gave birth to a baby boy who was given up for adoption. She's also claimed to have had a sexual relationship with her brother Keith. Her grandfather kicked her out of their home not long after she gave birth, and she resorted to living in the woods. She led a transient lifestyle throughout her life and faced various run-ins with the law. She began working as a sex worker at 15 years old. In 1976, she married wealthy 69-year-old yacht club owner Louis Fell. However, their marriage did not last for long. Fell annulled their marriage shortly after their wedding after Aileen had been arrested for assaulting a bartender. Hull also filed a restraining order against Wournos, claiming she would beat him with his cane. He's also said that Wournos squandered his money. Following the divorce, Wournos moved back to Michigan, and her brother eventually passed away from cancer, leaving her $10,000 in life insurance. She used the money to pay a DUI fine and buy herself a luxury car, which she crashed shortly after purchasing it. Wournos returned to Florida and was in and out of jail for the next several years. In 1986, 30-year-old Wournos met 24-year-old hotel maid Tyra Moore at a gay bar in Daytona Beach, Florida. The pair began an intense romantic relationship until the time of her death. Wournos claimed to have loved more. They moved in together and lived off Wournos' earnings as a sex worker.
Over a 12-month period, beginning in November 1989, Wuornos murdered 7 male clients while engaging in sex work. According to Florida's News Channel 8, her modus operandi was to approach unsuspecting men under the guise of needing a ride or offering sex for money before robbing and shooting them to death with a 22 caliber pistol she kept in her purse. Her first victim was 51-year-old Richard Mallory. On November 30th, 1989, Mallory picked up Wuornos on his way home from work. She would later claim in court that Mallory, who had a history of sexual violence, had brutally beaten and raped her, thus killing him in self-defense. The following day, Mallory's car with some of his belongings was found in Ormond Beach, Florida. His body was discovered 2 weeks later in Daytona Beach, Florida. Her other victims included Dick Humphreys, Troy Burris, David Spears, Walter Gino Antonio, Peter Sims, and Charles Carskadden. According to the Clark County prosecutor, items belonging to Mallory and Antonio were pawned near Daytona Beach, and the alias names used were traced to Wuornos and Moore through thumbprints left on the pawn shop cards and palm prints left in the crashed vehicle of Peter Sims. Sims's body has still never been found. On January 9, 1991, Wuornos was arrested for Richard Mallory's murder at the Last Resort Bar in Port Orange, Florida, and Moore was found in Stratton, Pennsylvania. Moore told police she had known about the murder since, quote, Lee had come home with Richard Mallory's Cadillac, end quote. She claimed that Wuornos confessed that she had killed a man that day, and that Moore had told Wuornos that she, quote, didn't want to hear about it, end quote. In exchange for immunity, Moore agreed to help the police get a confession from Aileen. During a recorded phone conversation, Wuornos admitted to killing 6 men and said that Moore was completely innocent. She again confessed to the murders during a police interrogation. While in jail awaiting trial, Wuornos was legally adopted by a Christian couple, Arlene and Richard Prowl. Arlene said, quote, the reason we did it is we want her to know what it feels like to have a family that really cares about her, end quote. The Prowls remained close to Aileen throughout the rest of her life. Wuornos' trial for the killing of Richard Mallory began in January 1992. During the trial, Moore testified saying that Wuornos didn't seem very upset when she told her about Mallory's death. A dozen other men also came forward to speak of their encounters with Wuornos. A Florida law known as the Williams Rule allowed information about the other killings to be presented to the jury since it showed a pattern of Wuornos' alleged behavior. However, Mallory's history of sexual violence was not presented to the jury. Both of these factors made Wuornos' claim of self-defense less believable. At trial, a taped confession played for the jury in which Wuornos said, quote, I took a life. I am willing to give up my life because I kill people. I deserve to die, end quote. Her public defender did not want her to stand trial, but Wuornos wanted to tell her story. This turned out to be disastrous, as Wuornos became irate during her cross-examination. She was the only defense witness.
On January 27th, the jury returned with their verdict after only 2 hours of deliberating. They found Wuornos guilty of first-degree murder. As the jury left the courtroom, Wuornos yelled, quote, I'm innocent, I was raped, I hope you get raped, scumbags of America, end quote. The death penalty phase of her trial began the following day. Expert witnesses for the defense testified that Wuornos was mentally ill, that she suffered from borderline personality disorder, and that her tumultuous upbringing had stunted and ruined her. One of her public defenders called Wuornos, quote, a damaged, primitive child, end quote. Despite their attempts to spare Wuornos' life, jurors recommended she be put to death, and on January 31st, the presiding judge sentenced Wuornos to death. She was later sentenced to death 5 more times. She was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002. Aileen's last words were, quote, yes, I would just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock and I'll be back, like Independence Day with Jesus. June 6th, like the movie. Big mothership and all, I'll be back, end quote. She was the 10th woman in the U.S. and the second in Florida to be executed after the death penalty was reinstated in 1976.
Theodore Robert Cowell was born on November 24, 1946, to Louise Cowell in Burlington, Vermont, at the Elizabeth Ludd Home for Unwed Mothers. He never knew who his father was. Louise claimed she had been seduced by a war veteran named Jack Worthington, who abandoned her soon after she became pregnant with Ted. For the first 3 years of his life, Bundy lived in the Philadelphia home of his maternal grandparents, Samuel and Eleanor Cowell, who raised him as their son to avoid the social stigma that accompanied birth outside of wedlock. Family, friends, and even young Ted were told that his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his older sister. He eventually discovered the truth. Biographer and true crime writer Anne Rule, who knew Bundy personally, believed that he did not find out until 1969, when he located his original birth certificate from Vermont. Bundy expressed a lifelong resentment towards his mother for never talking to him about his real father and for leaving him to discover his true parentage for himself. In 1950, Louise changed her surname from Cowell to Nelson, and at the urging of multiple family members, left Philadelphia with Ted to live in Tacoma, Washington. In 1951, Louise met Johnny Culpeper Bundy. They married later that year, and Johnny Bundy formally adopted Ted. Johnny and Louise conceived 4 children of their own, and though Johnny tried to include his adoptive son in camping trips and other family activities, Ted remained distant. He later complained to his girlfriend that Johnny wasn't his real father, quote unquote, wasn't very bright, and quote unquote, didn't make much money. During high school, he was arrested at least twice on suspicion of burglary and auto theft. When he reached age 18, the details of these incidents were expunged from his record, which is the standard. After graduating from the University of Washington in 1972, Bundy joined Governor Daniel J. Evans' re-election campaign. After Evans was re-elected, Bundy was hired as an assistant to Ross Davis, chairman of the Washington State Republican Party. In early 1973, despite mediocre LSAT scores, Bundy was accepted into the law school of UPS and the University of Utah on the strength of letters of recommendations from Evans, Davis, and several UW psychology professors.
There is no consensus on when or where Bundy began killing women. He told different stories to different people and refused to divulge the specifics of his earliest crimes, even as he confessed in graphic detail to dozens of later murders in the days preceding his execution. Shortly after midnight on January 4th, 1974, Bundy entered the basement apartment of 18-year-old Karen Sparks. Sparks was a dancer and student at UW. After attacking Sparks brutally with a metal rod from her bed frame, he sexually assaulted her with either the same rod, causing extensive internal injuries. She remained unconscious for 10 days but survived with permanent physical and mental disabilities. In the early morning hours of February 1st, Bundy broke into the basement apartment of Linda Ann Healy, another UW undergraduate. He beat her unconscious and dressed her in blue jeans, a white blouse, and boots. On March 12th, Donna Manson, a 19-year-old student at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, left her dorm to attend a concert on campus but never arrived. On April 17th, Susan Rancourt disappeared while on her way to her dorm room after an evening advisors meeting at Central Washington State College in Ellensburg. On May 6th, Roberta Parks left her dormitory at Oregon State University in Corvallis to have coffee with friends at the Memorial Union but never arrived. Detectives from the King County and Seattle Police Departments grew increasingly concerned. There was no significant physical evidence, and the women had little in common apart from being young, attractive white college students with long hair parted in the middle. On June 1st, Brenda Ball disappeared after leaving the Flame Tavern in Burien near Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. In the early hours of June 11th, UW student Georgianne Hawkins vanished while walking down a brightly lit alley between her boyfriend's dormitory residence and her sorority house. Bundy later recounted that he lured Hawkins to his car and knocked her unconscious with a crowbar. After handcuffing her, he drove her to a suburb of Seattle where he strangled her and spent the entire night with her body. He revisited her body at least 3 times. After Hawkins' disappearance was publicized, witnesses came forward to report seeing him that night in an alley behind a nearby dormitory. He was on crutches with a leg cast and was struggling to carry a briefcase. One woman recalled that the man asked her to help him carry the case to his car, a light brown Volkswagen Beetle.
Reports of the 6 missing women and Sparks' brutal beating appeared in newspapers and on television throughout Washington and Oregon. There was pressure on law enforcement to solve the disappearances, but the lack of physical evidence severely hampered them. Police could not provide reporters with the little information that was available for fear of compromising the investigation. Similarities between the victims were noted, including the disappearances all taking place at night, usually near ongoing construction work within a week of midterm or final exams. All of the victims were wearing slacks or blue jeans, and at most crime scenes, there was a sighting of a man wearing a cast or a sling and driving a brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle. Bundy approached Janice Ann Ott, a probation caseworker at the Kings County Juvenile Court, with the sailboat story and watched her leave the beach in his company. About 4 hours later, Denise Marie Naslund, a 19-year-old woman who was studying to become a computer programmer, left a picnic to go to the restroom but never returned. On September 6, 2 hunters came across the skeletal remains of Ott and Naslund. An extra femur and several vertebrae found at the site were later identified by Bundy as those of Hawkins. 6 months later, forestry students from Green River Community College discovered the skulls and mandibles of Healy, Rancourt, Parks, and Ball on Taylor Mountain, where Bundy frequently hiked. Manson's remains were never recovered. In August 1974, Bundy received an acceptance from the University of Utah Law School and moved to Salt Lake City. On September 2nd, he raped and strangled a still unidentified hitchhiker in Idaho, then disposed of the remains in a nearby river. On October 2nd, he kidnapped 16-year-old Nancy Wilcock in Holiday. Her remains were buried near Capitol Reef National Park but were never found. Melissa Smith, the 17-year-old daughter of the police chief of Midvale, disappeared after leaving a pizza parlor. Her new body was found in a nearby mountainous area 9 days later. Postmortem examination indicated that she may have remained alive for up to 7 days following her disappearance. On October 31st, Laura Ann Elm disappeared after leaving a cafe just after midnight. Her naked body was found by hikers. Both women had been beaten, raped, sodomized, and strangled with nylon stockings. In the late afternoon of November 8th, Bundy approached 18-year-old telephone operator Carol Durant at Fashion Place Mall in Murray. He identified himself as quote-unquote Officer Roseland of the Murray Police Department and told Carol that someone had attempted to break into her car. He asked her to accompany him to the station to file a complaint. When Carol pointed out to Bundy that he was driving on a road that did not lead to the police station, he immediately pulled onto the shoulder and attempted to handcuff her. During their struggle, he inadvertently fastened both handcuffs to the same wrist, and Carol was able to open the car door and escape.
Later that evening, Deborah Kent, a 17-year-old student at Viewmont High School in Bountiful, disappeared after leaving a theater production at the school to pick up her brother. Outside the auditorium, investigators found a key that unlocked the handcuffs removed from Carol Durant's wrist. On April 12th, a 23-year-old registered nurse named Karen Campbell disappeared while walking down a well-lit hallway between the elevator and her room at the Wildwood Inn in Snowmass Village. On March 15th, ski instructor Julie Cunningham disappeared while walking from her apartment to a dinner date with a friend. Bundy later told Colorado investigators that he approached Cunningham on crutches and asked her to help carry his ski boots to his car, where he clubbed and handcuffed her, then assaulted and strangled her at a secondary site near Rifle. Denise Oliverson disappeared near the Utah-Colorado border in Grand Junction on April 6th while riding her bicycle to her parents' house. On May 6th, Bundy lured 12-year-old Lynette Dawn Culver from Alameda Junior High School in Pocatello, Idaho. He drowned and then sexually assaulted her in his hotel room before disposing of her body in a river. On June 28th, Susan Curtis vanished from the campus of Brigham Young University in Provo. The bodies of Wilcox, Kent, Cunningham, Oliverson, Culver, and Curtis were never recovered. On August 16, 1975, Bundy was arrested by Utah Highway Patrol Officer Bob Hayward in Granger. Hayward observed Bundy cruising a residential area in the pre-dawn hours and fleeing at high speed after seeing the patrol car. Hayward noticed that the Volkswagen's front passenger seat had been removed and placed on the rear seats and searched the car. He found a ski mask, a second mask fashioned from pantyhose, a crowbar, handcuffs, trash bags, a coil of rope, an ice pick, and other items initially assumed to be burglary tools. In September, Bundy sold his Volkswagen Beetle to a Midvale teenager. Utah police impounded it and FBI technicians searched it. They found hairs matching samples obtained from Karen Campbell's body. Later, they also identified hair strands quote-unquote microscopically indistinguishable from those of Melissa Smith and Carol Duranch. On October 2nd, detectives put Bundy into a lineup. Duranch immediately identified him as Officer Roseland, and witnesses from Bountiful recognized him as the stranger at the high school auditorium. In February 1976, Bundy stood trial for the Duranch kidnapping. On the advice of his attorney, John O'Connell, Bundy waived his right to a jury due to the negative publicity surrounding the case. After a 4-day bench trial and a weekend of deliberation, Judge Stuart Hanson Jr. found him guilty of kidnapping and assault. In June, he was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in the Utah State Prison. In October, he was found hiding in bushes in the prison yard carrying a quote-unquote escape kit that included road maps, airline schedules, and a social security card, and spent several weeks in solitary confinement. Later that month, Colorado authorities charged him with Karen Campbell's murder. After a period of resistance, he waived extradition proceedings and was transferred to Aspen in January 1977. On June 7, 1977, Bundy was transported 40 miles from the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs to Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen for a preliminary hearing. He had elected to serve as his own attorney and thus was excused by the judge from wearing handcuffs or leg shackles. During a recess, he asked to visit the courthouse's law library to research his case. While shielded from his guard's view behind a bookcase, he opened a window and jumped to the ground from the second story, injuring his right ankle as he landed. After shedding an outer layer of clothing, he walked through Aspen as roadblocks were being set up on its outskirts, then hiked southward onto Aspen Mountain. Near its summit, he broke into a hunting cabin and stole food, clothing, and a rifle.
On June 10th, he broke into a camping trailer on Maroon Lake. 3 days later, he stole a car at the edge of the Aspen golf course. He drove back into Aspen, where 2 police officers noticed his car weaving in and out of its lane and pulled him over. By the time he had been captured, he had been on the run for 6 days. In the car were maps of the mountain area around Aspen that prosecutors were using to demonstrate the location of Karen Campbell's body, indicating that his escape was not a spontaneous act but had been planned. On the night of December 30th, while most of the jail staff was on Christmas break and nonviolent prisoners on furlough with their families, Bundy piled books and files in his bed, covered them with a blanket to simulate his sleeping body, and climbed into the crawl space. He broke through the ceiling into the apartment of the chief jailer, who was not there at the time. Bundy changed into street clothes from the jailer's closet and walked out the front door. After stealing a car, Bundy drove eastward out of Glenwood Springs, but the car soon broke down in the mountains on Interstate 70. He hitchhiked to Vail. He then took a bus to Denver and boarded a morning flight to Chicago. In Glenwood Springs, the jail's skeleton crew did not discover the escape until noon on December 31st, more than 17 hours later. By then, Bundy was already in Chicago. From Chicago, Bundy traveled by train to Ann Arbor, Michigan. He stole a car and drove south to Atlanta, where he boarded a bus and arrived in Tallahassee, Florida on the morning of January 8th. He stayed for one night in the Holiday Inn Hotel before he rented a room under the alias Chris Hagen at a boarding house near the Florida State University campus. In the early hours of January 15, 1978, Bundy entered FSU's Chi Omega sorority house through a rear door that had a faulty locking mechanism. At around 2:45 a.m., he bludgeoned Margaret Bowman, 21, with a piece of oak firewood as she slept. He then strangled her with a nylon stocking. He then entered the bedroom of 20-year-old Lisa Levy and beat her unconscious, strangled her, tore one of her nipples, bit deeply into her left buttocks, and sexually assaulted her with a hair mist bottle. In the adjoining bedroom, he attacked Kathy Kleiner, breaking her jaw and deeply lacerating her shoulder, and Karen Chandler, who suffered a concussion, broken jaw, loss of teeth, and a crushed finger. Chandler and Kleiner survived the attack.
Bundy escaped, but not before being seen by sorority sister Nita Neary, who came through the back door and saw Bundy as he was exiting the sorority house. Tallahassee detectives determined that the 4 attacks took place in a total of less than 15 minutes, within earshot of more than 30 witnesses who heard nothing. After leaving the sorority house, Bundy broke into a basement apartment 8 blocks away and attacked FSU student Cheryl Thomas, dislocating her shoulder and fracturing her jaw and skull in 5 places. She was left with permanent deafness and equilibrium damage that ended her dance career. On Thomas's bed, police found a semen stain and a pantyhose mask containing 2 hairs that were, quote, similar to Bundy's in class and characteristic, end quote. Kimberly Diane Leach was summoned to her homeroom by a teacher to retrieve a forgotten purse. She never returned to class. 7 weeks later, after an intensive search, her partially mummified remains were found in a pig farrowing shed. She appeared to have been raped, then killed by neck lacerations with a knife. On February 12th, with insufficient cash to pay his overdue rent and a growing suspicion that police were closing in on him, Bundy stole a car and fled Tallahassee, driving westward across the Florida Panhandle. 3 days later, at around 1 a.m., he was stopped by Pensacola police officer David Lee near the Alabama state line after a quote-unquote wants and warrants check showed his Volkswagen Beetle was stolen. When told he was under arrest, Bundy kicked Lee's legs out from under him and took off running. Lee fired 2 warning shots, then gave chase and tackled him. The two struggled over Lee's gun before the officer finally subdued and arrested Bundy. Following a change of venue to Miami, Bundy stood trial for the Chi Omega homicides and assaults in June 1979. At trial, crucial testimony came from Chi Omega sorority members Connie Hastings, who placed Bundy in the vicinity of the Chi Omega house that evening, and Nita Neary, who saw him leaving the sorority house clutching the oak murder weapon. The jury deliberated for less than 7 hours before convicting him on July 24, 1979, of the Bowman and Levy murders. 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder for the assaults on Kleiner, Chandler, and Thomas, and 2 counts of burglary. Trial Judge Edward Cower imposed death sentences for the murder convictions.
6 months later, a second trial took place in Orlando for the abduction and murder of Kimberly Leach. Bundy was found guilty once again, and after less than 8 hours deliberation, due principally to the testimony of an eyewitness who saw him leading Kimberly from the schoolyard to the stolen van. During the penalty phase of the trial, Bundy took advantage of an obscure Florida law providing that a marriage declaration in court in the presence of a judge constituted a legal marriage. As he was questioning former Washington State DES co-worker Carol Ann Boone, who had moved to Florida to be near Bundy, had testified on his behalf during both trials and was again testifying on his behalf as a character witness, he asked her to marry him. She accepted, and Bundy declared to the court that they were legally married. On February 10, 1980, Bundy was sentenced for a 3rd time to death by electrocution. As the sentence was announced, he reportedly stood and shouted, quote, "Tell the jury they were wrong," end quote. This 3rd death sentence would be the one that was ultimately carried out nearly 9 years later. Bundy was executed by electric chair at 9:16 a.m. on January 24, 1989. His last words were, quote, "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends," end quote. This was a reference to his attorneys Jim Coleman and Methodist minister Fred Lawrence.
Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. He had 2 sisters and was close with both of his siblings as well as his mother. His father was an alcoholic that was abusive to their entire family. His sister Karen would later say that the siblings learned to toughen up against the beatings and that Gacy would not cry. John endured physical and emotional abuse from his father, who often called him a sissy, queer, a disappointment, and stupid. He always felt like a disappointment to his dad, and this caused him to crave acceptance even into his adulthood. John's mom defended her son when he was faced with this abuse, but that only made the abuse from his father worse. John enjoyed gardening and spending time with his mom, and as a young child, his mother and sister said that Gacy would wear his mother's underwear. In 1951, at the age of 9, John was diagnosed with a congenital heart condition that made it difficult to play with other children. And 2 years later, he began suffering from blackouts that were believed to have been caused by a blood clot after being hit in the head with a swing. His father accused him of faking the blackouts for sympathy, but his mom and sisters believed him, though his exact medical condition was never conclusively diagnosed. He spent lots of time in the hospital because of the blackouts, and it likely caused his grades in school to suffer. He never graduated high school, and as a young adult, he ran away to Las Vegas, Nevada after constant fights with his dad over a car that his dad had bought him. In Las Vegas, he found work as a mortuary assistant and slept in a room behind the embalming room. He later claimed that one night he climbed into a coffin and cuddled and fondled with the body of a deceased teenage boy. Gacy was shocked by his own actions. He then returned home to Illinois, and in 1963 he graduated from a business college. He soon married Marilyn Myers and moved to Waterloo, Iowa. Marilyn came from a wealthy family, and her father owned several Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants, and Gacy managed these KFCs with the hopes of one day taking over the franchises from her father. He actually even demanded people call him the Colonel, like Colonel Sanders. Gacy was becoming a prominent and respected citizen of Waterloo and served as vice president of the JCs, a civic leadership organization that revolved around community service. He was known to be charming and eager to volunteer for any project he could. Gacy and Marilyn had a son in 1966, and while Marilyn was in labor, Gacy was having one of his first gay sexual experiences with a JC member. Gacy and Marilyn soon welcomed their second child, a daughter, in 1967. Gacy would describe this period of his life as perfect, and it seemed he finally gained the respect of his father.
But things were not as perfect as they appeared. Young male staff members at the KFCs alleged Gacy would hit on them and make them uncomfortable. Members of the JCs were also swingers and regularly abused drugs. Gacy and Marilyn were involved with swinging, and Gacy was known to supply teenage boys and young men with drugs, alcohol, sex workers, and illegal pornography as a means to recruit them into the JCs. Since he was always around young men and teenagers, questions of his sexuality began to arise from friends and those around him. In 1968, Gacy was accused of sexually assaulting the 15-year-old son of a prominent JC member. The boy claimed that after Gacy had given him drugs and alcohol, he forced him to perform a sex act and gave him $50 for his silence. The boy confided to his parents, and Gacy was arrested for the sexual assault and attempted assault on another teenage boy. Gacy claimed he was innocent and that the accusation was politically motivated. He even demanded the police give him a polygraph test that, of course, he failed. He then paid a KFC employee to attack the 15-year-old boy and intimidate him into not testifying. Gacy was ultimately convicted of sodomy and sentenced to 10 years in state prison. His wife divorced him shortly after, and Gacy never saw their children again. Gacy was only 26 years old when he entered prison. He was a model prisoner and very friendly with inmates and guards. He became the head cook and advocated for wage increases for prisoners. He was even featured on a local television show doing a report on the prison. Gacy's dad passed away while he was in prison, which took a major toll on him. He felt as though his dad died ashamed of him. Of his 10-year sentence, he served only 18 months and was released on parole in June of 1970. He returned home to Chicago and was adjusting to life after prison relatively well. But in February of 1971, he was accused of sexually assaulting another teenage boy, but the boy failed to show up to court and the charges were dropped. The Iowa Board of Parole completely missed this, and 1 year after his release, his parole was finished. Gacy soon started a contracting business and generally decided to hire young teenage boys. He claimed this was to keep costs low. Gacy again became involved with the JCs and his local Democratic Party. He was again a well respected member of his community, full of ambition. Just like in Waterloo, he threw crazy parties with drugs, alcohol, and porn to recruit new members to both organizations. He also started volunteering in hospitals and doing magic tricks for sick kids as Pogo the Clown.
The first known murder of Gacy's was 16-year-old Tim McCoy in 1972. McCoy had been traveling for the holidays, and Gacy met him at a Greyhound bus station. They had sex at Gacy's house, and Gacy claims the next morning he awoke to see McCoy holding a kitchen knife in the doorway. Thinking he was under attack, Gacy stabbed McCoy with the knife, killing him. In reality, McCoy was just cooking them breakfast. Gacy hid McCoy's body in the crawl space of his home. This murder was impulsive but seemed to have lit a spark within Gacy, who would later claim that he had an orgasm while killing the boy. Not long after, he sexually assaulted another teenage boy who was able to escape. The boy went to the police, but they let Gacy off with a warning. I think they claimed that they were just really busy at the time. In 1975, Gacy murdered John Butkovich, an 18-year-old employee of his. Butkovich was going to Gacy's house to pick up his paycheck and seemingly vanished. Butkovich's family knew Gacy had to be involved because of this, but the police never followed up and thought Butkovich was a runaway. In March 1976, Carol and Gacy got divorced. With his wife and stepchildren out of his home, Gacy was free to do as he pleased. Between 1976 and 1978, he raped and killed 23 teenage boys and young adult men. Several of these boys were Gacy's employees. Their families even spoke to Gacy after their sons disappeared, and he attempted to get them off his tracks. I think he typically said the boys were runaways. How many times have we heard that before? Gacy would regularly abduct boys off the street at gunpoint, but some were lured to his home. Strangulation with a rope tourniquet, which he called the rope trick, was his typical method of murder, but several of his victims died of asphyxiation as well, and those victims' bodies were found with clothing and fabric in their throats. He'd then bury his victims' bodies in the crawl space of his house. If anyone asked about the smell, he'd say there was a sewage problem. He even had employees dig trenches in the crawl space and spread powdered lime to help with the smell. Once he ran out of space, he dumped bodies along the Des Plaines River. Survivors of Gacy said he'd handcuff them as part of a trick. Some escaped, some were let go by Gacy, and at least one victim was dumped after being attacked but managed to get help. And it's thought that this victim in particular, Gacy likely believed he was dead, and he wasn't, thankfully. In 1978, Gacy abducted and murdered 15-year-old Robert Peast after speaking to him at a pharmacy. Peast told his mom he was going to speak to a man about a job, and Peast's boss informed his mom that the man in question was John Wayne Gacy. The police took this case seriously as they didn't think Robert would have been a runaway, and when they looked into Gacy, they found his past sodomy conviction and that he had been questioned in the disappearance of John Butkovich. They began surveilling Gacy 24/7. And like he did with many other people, Gacy charmed the officers surveilling him. He even invited them in for meals and drinks and generally appeared cocky, but in reality, he was very paranoid. Officers actually did go in when they were invited in by him, and looking around, they found a 1975 class ring, clothing that was too small for him, and a foul smell coming from beneath the house. Later that month, Gacy confessed his crimes to his lawyers, but he claimed that the boys were just prostitutes, liars, and hustlers. He told them that he gave the boys the rope trick and buried them in his crawl space and along the Des Plaines River. Gacy was soon arrested for marijuana possession and held by police while another search of his house took place. He either gave police or his lawyers a drawing of the basement with the bodies stacked on one another. The police found Gacy's basement flooded, which Gacy had done himself by unplugging the sump pump, and had to wait for the water to drain before a search of the space could begin. In total, they found 29 bodies in Gacy's home, and they had to rely on dental records and x-rays to identify the boys. Several more bodies were found on the banks of the Des Plaines River, including that of Robert Peast.
During his 1980 trial, Gacy was found to be mentally fit to stand trial. Despite this, he pled not guilty by reason of insanity. Arguments from the prosecution and defense focused on Gacy's mental state during the time of the murders. The defense claimed that he was a paranoid schizophrenic and suffered from multiple personality disorder, and that his clown persona was one of these personalities. They also argued that he suffered from long lasting trauma due to his abusive childhood. But the prosecution claimed he was a ruthless killer and showed clear premeditation in his murders. On March 12th, he was found guilty of 33 counts of murder, sexual assault, and indecent liberties with a child. He was sentenced to 12 death sentences. While on death row, Gacy gave many interviews and often gave stories that differed from one another. He proclaimed he was innocent and essentially blamed the victims for being killed because of their risky behaviors. He also dabbled in painting while awaiting his execution, and some are still available to buy. He was put to death by lethal injection on May 10, 1994, with a crowd of people outside eagerly awaiting his death. His last meal was made up of a bucket of KFC chicken, fried shrimp, strawberries, french fries, and a Diet Coke. His last words were "kiss my ass." Since then, his brain has been analyzed but showed nothing of note. His home was destroyed and a new home was built upon the lot. It was last up for sale in 2019. We wanted to take a moment to honor the 27 identified and 6 unidentified victims of John Wayne Gacy. Timothy McCoy, 16. John Bukovich, 18. Darrell Sampson, 19. Samuel Stapleton, 14. Randall Raffett, 15. Michael Bonin, 17. William Billy Carroll, 16. Jimmy Hankinson, 16. Rick Johnston, 17. William George Bundy, 19. Michael Marino, 14. Kenneth Parker, 16. Gregory Gotzik, 17. John Sick, 19. John Prestige, 20.
Matthew Bowman, 18. Robert Gilroy, 18. John Mallory, 19. Russell Nelson, 21 or 22. Robert Winch, 18. Tommy Bowling, 20. David Talsma, 20. William Kindred, 19. Timothy O'Rourke, 20. Frank Landingen, 19. James Mazzara, 20. Robert Peast, 15. And as we said, there are 6 unidentified victims. The victims are numbered, I believe, when they were found in his house. So we have victim 28 between the ages of 14 and 18. Victim 5, 22 to 31. Victim 26, 22 to 30. Victim 13, 17 to 21. Victim 21, 21 to 27. And victim 10, 17 to 21.